There are moments in life when a single sentence splits your world open, when the story everyone has agreed to believe finally loses its grip, and the truth steps out into the light on steady, undeniable legs. For me, that moment arrived at exactly 2:14 p.m. on Easter Sunday in a sunlit dining room, scented with rosemary ham and warm bread, when my 81-year-old grandmother set down her fork, glanced between my brother and me, and asked with absolute calm, "So, you bought his company out of pity." It was as if someone had cracked the earth's crust right beneath our table. The conversation died instantly, every breath suspended, every gaze shifting toward me. And before I tell you what happened next, before the truth finally shook loose from years of silence, I need to take you back to the beginning of a story that was never supposed to be mine. Growing up in the Reyes household meant living in the gravitational pull of my older brother Evan. He was the family's prodigy, the boy genius who could dismantle a router at 10 years old and rebuild it before dinner. People in our neighborhood talked about him the way small towns talk about local legends. Teachers adored him. Coaches admired him. Even strangers at Sunday Mass would pat him on the back and whisper to my mother, "That one's going far." My parents soaked it in every nod, every compliment, as if Evan's brilliance were a kind of inheritance they'd earned through good parenting. Meanwhile, I learned to make myself small in the corners of those conversations, the quiet daughter with a notebook and a fascination for how systems fit together, how people made decisions, how technology shaped lives far beyond the screen. My family saw none of that. They saw a shy girl who wrote neat essays and didn't cause trouble, and in their eyes, nothing I achieved ever quite sparkled the way Evan's work did. When he built his first web app, my father framed the printed homepage and hung it in the hallway. When I won a regional debate award, it sat on my dresser collecting dust. None of this was done with cruelty. It was simply the natural order of our household, the orbit everyone adjusted to without ever questioning it. Evan went to Caltech to study computer science, and my parents told every relative we had that their son was headed for brilliance. I, 2 years behind him, enrolled at Stanford to study behavioral analytics and business strategy. But to my family, Stanford was simply where Mara is. They didn't ask about my classes or internships or the research project I published my senior year. They never meant harm. They simply couldn't imagine that anything outside coding or engineering could possibly matter in the tech world they'd built in their minds. After college, Evan founded a startup called Voltage, an ambitious AI-powered system for optimizing energy usage in commercial buildings. It was clever, elegant, technically impressive, all the things he'd always excelled at. He demoed early prototypes at holidays, speaking in rapid strings of jargon that made everyone nod along, despite understanding only half of it. My father once joked, "I don't know what it does, but it sounds expensive," and the whole table laughed. Meanwhile, I'd begun my first job at a startup in San Francisco called Pivot Path, working in product operations, translating between engineers who built features and the users who struggled to understand them. Evan teased me relentlessly about it, calling me the PowerPoint person, insisting I wasn't in real tech. And as always, I let the comments slide like water over stone. But the truth, the one no one in my family ever thought to ask about, was that while Evan was chasing funding rounds and late-night code deployments, I was slowly, quietly building a career that would eventually place me in the center of decisions that shaped our industry. I never broadcasted it. I never corrected my family when they assumed I worked in marketing. I simply kept climbing in silence, believing peace was worth more than recognition. That belief held until the day I saw his company's name appear on an acquisition shortlist for Heliodyne Labs. I still remember the exact moment my eyes landed on the name. It was early on a Wednesday morning around 8:10 a.m., the kind of fog-softened San Francisco morning where the air feels thick enough to swallow sound. I was sitting at my desk at Heliodyne Labs, a half-eaten sesame bagel beside my keyboard, skimming through the preliminary scouting report for potential acquisitions. My team had spent 6 weeks filtering through dozens of small companies, sorting noise from brilliance long-shot fantasies, from genuinely promising breakthroughs, and I'd read enough of these reports to move through them quickly. But when I reached the top of the list and saw voltage, something in my chest stalled. For a heartbeat, I thought it must be a coincidence, another startup with a similar name, perhaps. But as soon as I opened the file, I saw Evan's name stamped across the header, founder Evan Reyes, CTO Evan Reyes, technical lead Evan Reyes. It hit me like a wave of cold air sweeping straight through my spine. I blinked, leaning back in my chair as the charts and numbers sharpened into focus burn rate, rising fast revenue, stagnating user adoption, flatlining 2 failed funding rounds in the past 18 months. His technology was stunning, elegant architecture, sophisticated machine learning models, a predictive system that could have reshaped energy efficiency across entire cities. But tech alone, I knew all too well, doesn't carry a company. My fingers hovered above the keyboard as I stared at the projection analysis. He was 3 months, maybe 4 at best, from layoffs. The knot that formed inside me wasn't satisfaction or vindication. It was sadness, a heavy, aching recognition that for all his brilliance, Evan had built a machine too complex for one person to keep afloat. The irony wasn't lost on me. The brother who had dismissed my work, my entire life, was now unknowingly dependent on a company and a sister he'd always called not real tech. I knew immediately what I had to do. I walked down the quiet hallway toward my vice president, Simone Patel, a woman whose eyes held sharp intelligence beneath her calm demeanor. When I explained the situation, my personal connection to this potential acquisition, and recommended that I be placed in an advisory-only role, Simone listened with that steady focus of hers before nodding and saying, "Thank you for telling me, Mara. We'll maintain full transparency." Within 20 minutes, she'd reassigned final negotiating authority to another strategist on our team, ensuring I wouldn't be involved in anything that might raise conflict of interest concerns. But she still asked me to stay on as an advisor because, as she put it gently, your insight into both the tech and the founder is too valuable to lose. So for the next several weeks, I became a quiet observer on the periphery of meetings, where Evan's company was dissected piece by piece. I offered context when asked, flagged inefficiencies that others might not catch, and helped translate some of his more ambitious technical visions into practical integration possibilities. Every comment I made was carefully documented, every suggestion logged with an almost clinical devotion to transparency. It was strange, surreal even to sit in glass-walled conference rooms, analyzing his life's work with the same precision I'd apply to any other startup. For the first time, I saw his genius the way an investor or M&A strategist would see it: raw, compelling, but dangerously unstructured. Outside of work, life moved on as though nothing were shifting beneath the surface. Family dinners were the same as predictable as the mismatched chairs around my parents' dining table. During my mother's birthday gathering, Evan casually mentioned that he was exploring strategic options, and my father nodded with pride, saying, "See, that's how real innovators talk." I stirred my soup quietly, Grandma Lila watching me with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. I thought I could keep the two worlds separate, my silent role at Heliodyne, and the familiar, comfortable illusion my family held. But the truth has a way of rising at the exact moment you've grown tired of swallowing it. And for me, that moment arrived on Easter Sunday, carried on the edge of a smirk and a single careless sentence. Easter lunch at my parents' house had always followed the same rhythm, my mother fussing over the ham glaze, my father trying to carve the roast too early, my Aunt Denise whispering gossip to whoever sat nearest, and Grandma Lila presiding at the end of the table like a queen who'd earned her crown by outliving everyone's nonsense. That afternoon, sunlight spilled through the dining room windows in warm sheets of gold, catching dust motes and the shimmer of glassware, as if trying to bless the meal before the inevitable chaos of family chatter began. I took my usual seat beside Grandma across from Evan and his wife Hannah and tried to fold myself into the pleasant small talk that always filled the first half hour. It almost worked until Evan leaned back in his chair, lifted his glass, and said with a casual smirk, "Not everyone can handle a real career in tech." He meant it like a joke tossed out as lightly as the rolls being passed around, but the pride behind it gleamed too sharply to ignore. The table fell into that awkward half-laughter families use as a shield, and I felt my fork pause halfway to my plate. For years, I had let comments like that pass, letting silence take the blow, so conflict wouldn't have to. For years, I'd believed that swallowing frustration was just another form of love, but something in me tightened a quiet refusal, curling at the edges, and before I could decide whether to respond, Grandma Lila lifted her head, looked Evan squarely in the eye, then turned to me and asked in her clear, unshakable voice, "So you bought his company out of pity?" It was as if the air vanished from the room. Every movement froze. My mother's hand hovered above the mashed potatoes. My father blinked like he'd been struck, and Evan stared at Grandma as though she'd suddenly switched to another language. I didn't speak, not at first. I simply lowered my gaze to the green beans on my plate and let the truth gather in my chest. When I finally exhaled, my voice came out steady, softened by the kind of calm that only comes after years of choosing silence. "I didn't buy it," I said. "Heliodyne Labs did. I simply led the team that recommended the acquisition." The reaction rippled around the table like the aftershock of a small earthquake. My father frowned with genuine confusion as he asked, "Wait, what do you mean you let it?" My mother pressed her napkin to her lap as though bracing for turbulence. Evan gave a short laugh, confident but already fraying, and said, "You're not in acquisitions, Mara. What do you even do again? Strategy marketing." I met his stare and answered, "I'm Director of Strategic Planning. Acquisition evaluations fall under my division." Hannah shifted, setting down her glass as her voice entered the conversation gently. "I saw Mara's name in the integration briefings, Evan. I thought you knew." He didn't. It showed in the way his shoulders tightened in the sharp edge that crept into his tone as he demanded, "So while I was in meetings with their execs, you were sitting behind the curtain pulling strings." The accusation hit like a thrown stone. But I didn't flinch. No one pulled anything I said, keeping my voice even. Voltage was running out of time. "We made an offer to preserve your technology and your team." He scoffed, leaning forward as he said, "So you did buy it out of pity?" Before I could answer, Grandma spoke calm, measured, and devastatingly clear. "No, sweetheart. She bought it out of competence." Her words landed like a gavel. Conversation collapsed into stunned silence. I felt every gaze shift toward me, not with dismissal for once, but with something closer, to realization. Evan pushed back his chair suddenly, the legs scraping against the floor like a spark catching dry leaves. Anger flushed through him as he said, "You've been waiting for this moment, watching me struggle, letting me fail so you could swoop in like some corporate vulture in heels." A tired, almost helpless laugh broke from me, not mocking, just worn out. "That's what you think I did," I said. "You think this was personal." He stood trembling between humiliation and denial, accusing me of sabotage, jealousy, every insecurity he'd never dared name aloud. I rose too, not to confront, but to steady myself, and said quietly, "The truth is, Evan, I never felt seen. Not by you, not by anyone at this table. But what I did at Heliodyne wasn't revenge. It was my job. It was strategy. It was leadership." He snapped back with, "You don't know real strategy. You work in slides and buzzwords. I build things." Something in me shifted then, a line finally straightening after years of bending. "You write code," I said gently but firmly. "You create beautiful systems, but you don't listen. You don't plan. You burn through money and hope like they'll never run out. Heliodyne bought Voltage because we wanted your ideas to survive even if your ego couldn't." For the first time, silence fell from Evan instead of me. and in that aching pause, something long hidden began to unravel between us. For several long seconds, no one at the table moved. Evan stood there rigid and pale, as if the truth had knocked the breath from his chest. His jaw worked soundlessly, anger, and something far more fragile flickering through his eyes. Finally, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked out through the kitchen, down the hallway, and out the front door. It slammed behind him with a trembling finality. The room remained frozen in the echo of it until Hannah slowly eased back into her chair and murmured, "He'll need time." My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the release of something I'd held inside for years, and when I finally sat back down, Grandma Lila placed her warm palm over mine in quiet solidarity. The rest of the family shifted in their seats, all of them visibly trying to stitch their composure back together. Aunt Denise cleared her throat as if trying to reset the atmosphere, but Grandma diffused the tension with her dry humor, saying, "Well, perhaps we should pass some perspective first." Nervous laughter swept through the table, the first crack of air after an emotional storm, and slowly conversation returned, stilted at first, cautious, as people skirted around the fracture that had just split open in front of them. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, my mind drifting to the porch where Evan had disappeared. When I finally stepped outside, the late afternoon light had shifted into a warm, honeyed glow. Evan sat on the edge of the steps with his elbows on his knees, his voltage stress ball turning slowly in his hands. He didn't look at me when he heard the door open. I sat a few feet away, leaving the space he needed. For a long while, we existed only in silence, two siblings finally stripped of performance. Eventually, he exhaled hard and said, "She really said that, huh, Grandma? She really did." His voice carried a bitter humor that didn't quite land. I nodded. "She sees things clearly," I said. "She always has." After a moment, he muttered, "You humiliated me in there." I looked ahead at the quiet street, not wanting to hit him with defensiveness or retreat. "I didn't plan to," I said softly. "I wasn't going to say anything, but when you joked about real tech careers, I couldn't stay silent anymore." He rubbed both hands over his face. "I've been using that line for years," he said. "I didn't even think about what it meant." The honesty of that admission softened something in me, and I answered, "That's the problem, Evan. You didn't think about how it landed." For the first time, his shoulders slumped, rather than squared. "Why didn't you ever correct me?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell us what you were doing?" I hesitated, choosing the truth instead of the easier answer, because I didn't think anyone wanted to know I said, because keeping the peace seemed easier than fighting for space, but that kind of peace, it's just silence with a prettier name. He stared at the stress ball in his hands, the little orange logo that had once held his future. "How bad was voltage?" he asked quietly. I answered with the gentlest truth I could offer. "Your tech was brilliant, but the business was bleeding. You were months away from layoffs." He closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of what he had refused to confront. When he finally opened them again, they were softer, stripped of defensiveness. "So you saved me," he whispered. I shook my head. "I saved your work, your team, your idea, not your pride." A faint, humorless laugh escaped him. "And now I work for you." I shook my head again. "You work with us. You'll report to Caleb in integration. He'll push you, but he's patient. You'll learn a lot." He studied me for a long moment before saying, "I don't know how to do this, Mara. Being second. Being wrong." I turned toward him, my voice gentle. "You're not second. You're just not alone anymore." For the first time that afternoon, he looked at me without rivalry, without the old patterns that had shaped us since childhood. Just two adults, two siblings, finally willing to see each other. When we walked back inside, the air felt different, not lighter, not yet healed, but honest. Hannah reached for his hand as he sat beside her again. My father stared at both of us, eyes clouded with questions he'd never thought to ask, until finally he looked at me and said softly, "Why didn't you tell us how far you'd come?" My mother followed with a tentative, We should have asked. Their voices were hesitant, remorseful, and for the first time they were asking about me, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to see what they had missed. Grandma gave my hand a small squeeze and said, "Better late than never, Dessert arrived apple pie, Evan's favorite, and the conversation that followed was awkward, but sincere. When Evan stood and cleared his throat, everyone fell silent again. He looked directly at me as he said, "I owe you all an apology. Especially you, Mara. I ignored your career, and when I couldn't ignore it anymore, I resented it, because it forced me to admit I wasn't the only one who mattered." His voice wavered. Mine did too, as I whispered, "Thank you. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and sometimes real is enough to begin again." 3 months after that Easter afternoon, the rhythm of our lives had settled into something entirely new, something steadier, more honest, and strangely almost effortless. Working under the same roof at Heliodyne Labs had felt awkward at first. Evan moved through the hallways with a stiffness that came from pride, nursing a bruise while I kept my guard half raised, unsure whether collaboration would reopen old wounds or begin to heal them. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls between us began to soften. Some of it was the nature of the work itself, problems too complex for ego days, too demanding for rivalry. But much of it came from Evan, learning how to listen, and from me, finally learning how to speak without waiting for permission. On a quiet Tuesday at 12:25 p.m., I found him hunched over a tablet in the Heliodyne cafeteria, pushing strands of hair off his forehead as he sketched out a new architecture diagram. He looked up briefly, his expression brightening in a way that still surprised me. "If we refactor the prediction loop here," he said, tapping the screen with a plastic fork, "we could probably reduce processing time by 18%. I leaned over the diagram, impressed. "Which will make enterprise clients very, very happy," I said. He grinned, leaning back smugly. "Especially that energy conglomerate we just signed, which your work helped close." His voice carried no resentment, only genuine acknowledgement, something I had waited most of my life to hear. There were still moments when the difference in our paths startled me, like when our parents visited the office for the first time. My mother brought cookies for the team. My father wandered around asking every engineer what a tech stack was. But when they saw the leadership wall with both our names, I watched comprehension dawn across their faces like sunrise warming a long, frozen field. Later that evening at dinner, my mother asked me about my job before she asked Evan, and the shock of it nearly made me drop my fork. It wasn't favoritism, it was recognition, the kind that had been missing for years. Grandma Lila, of course, noticed everything. She invited both of us for pot roast the following Sunday, insisting we stay after for chess. As we cleared dishes, she clasped our hands and said, "You two are like code and interface different layers, same purpose." Evan laughed, then teased, "She means we finally make a good team." I nudged him. "Don't get cocky." But inside, I felt something warm settle, where resentment had once lived. A week later, Evan and I presented our first joint roadmap at the Heliodyne Town Hall. The room was filled with nearly 300 people, the hum of anticipation vibrating through the air. I led with strategy. He followed with technical architecture. The synergy between us felt natural, almost intuitive, a partnership built not on childhood roles or unspoken competitions, but on newly earned respect. When we finished, the applause was loud enough to echo off the glass walls. Backstage, Evan nudged me with a grin and said, "You know, for someone who's just in marketing, you're kind of brilliant." I raised an eyebrow, unable to resist. "You're only just catching on." He laughed, genuine and warm. Better late than never. Walking out into the lobby afterwards, surrounded by the chatter of colleagues and the glow of shared accomplishment, I felt an unexpected truth bloom in my chest. For years, I had believed that my greatest achievements would come from strategy decks or product launches or navigating M&A negotiations. But standing beside my brother, no longer divided by old narratives or quiet resentment, I realized that the most meaningful thing I had ever helped build was this: a different version of us. a version grounded not in competition but collaboration, not in silence but truth, not in separate orbits but shared purpose. If you've ever spent years shrinking yourself to keep someone else comfortable or stayed quiet because it felt safer than being seen, I hope this story reminds you of something important. Peace built on silence isn't peace at all. Sometimes you need to let the truth rupture a room so something honest can grow in its place. Sometimes you need to take up the space you've earned, even if your voice shakes the first time you use it. And sometimes, if you're lucky, people will rise to meet the truer version of you that emerges. If this story moved you, please like the video so others can find it. Share it with someone who needs it and subscribe for more stories like this. And if you've ever had to reclaim your own voice, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments below.